Hey everyone! This is Module 5, Part 1 of Public Speaking. Part 1, we're going to be going over audience analysis, and then in Part 2, we'll cover choosing a purpose and then creating a thesis statement around that purpose. So starting with audience analysis, knowing your audience, throughout your speeches, all the speeches that you're going to be creating, in your preparation, you're going to have an audience-centered approach. So you're going to look at audience members' attributes and motivation while preparing your speech so it becomes meaningful to them. And the big thing about audience analysis is if your speech doesn't matter to your audience, your message is not heard. Thinking back on the communication model, when we encode a message, we encode that message specifically for the receiver. So the receiver decodes that message the same way you presented it, the same way that it was encoded. That way, the message doesn't change. The context does not change. Throughout any speech that you're given, you're going to modify your argument in your speech to the audience. It's not like an English paper where you're very straightforward and A plus B equals C. It's more like you create your A's and B's to, be attributed to that audience. So that audience is more willing to see why it leads to C. You have to be more influential. Looking back at Aristotle, we have to have logos, pathos, and ethos. And in order to have that ethos or that credibility for you as a speaker, your audience has to see you that way. And in order to see you that way, you use arguments with logos and you use pathos to deliver that argument. That way, they feel the emotion of the speech and you know how to reach them emotionally. So when you're creating and conducting your speech, when you're writing that outline, instead of writing it like an English paper, you do want to have aspects of it, your thesis, your organization, main point 1, 2, 3. But remember, you also want to pertain to the audience. So write it as if you're saying it and really think about the attributes and motivations of that audience. The first thing to look at is who are your listeners? In this class, you're going to be speaking to other students at Texas Tech. But what perspective is your taking of your audience, of your target audience? So who are you speaking to, your target, but what do you know about them? What helps you learn from your audience? And a big thing can be, what are they wearing? What are their attitudes when you stand up to give your presentation? All these different types of things, formality, who you're giving your presentation to, whether it's your boss or your classmates. This is how you need to present your message so you can present it and give it to them in a viewpoint that they can repeat back to you. But also evaluate other people's ideas, objects, and events. So when you analyze people's attitudes, you gotta make sure that you not only know who they are, but what do they believe in? Do they believe in the same thing that you're trying to present to them? And if not, if this is a new idea, maybe explaining it a little bit more. Maybe explaining to them your viewpoint, but then also presenting something that, might not necessarily be your viewpoint, but it allows the target audience to feel like you're contributing to them a little bit more as well. So analyzing audience beliefs versus their values. So you can't change someone's beliefs, but you can change their actions. So when you prepare a speech, make sure that it's not just heavy on your own perceived reality, but make sure that you really have a lot of influences in it. And don't necessarily come off of one belief. This is my ethical belief, and I believe we all should do this, but rather try to implement changes to people's actions or talk about different actions that benefit society overall that can end up helping people perceive a reality that could be better, rather than just stating a belief. So using a lot more adjectives, adverbs, coming at it a bit different, approaching it a bit differently than you would just one subjective claim or one subjective speech. Also, make sure you analyze the audience values. So making sure that you have statements of good and bad, but shaping attitudes and beliefs is not really done unless you change actions. So if you show actions of good and bad, these are always going to be better. Another thing too is who your audience is matters. Demographics do matter. Age and generational identity. So if you're talking to your grandparents or a nursing home, you're going to speak a little bit differently than you will for a bunch of Texas Tech students. And it doesn't mean that your idea changes. It's just the way that you speak and the way you say your words and come up with your words is going to be a little bit different for this class than it would when you go out into the future for your job. Except for the persuasive speech. The persuasive speech is very much a professional speech. But when creating your persuasive speech, you'll also have examples for the students that are going through the same things you are. So if you talk about flooding in Lubbock, you can talk about how hard it is to walk across campus and give those examples and provide visuals that the audience can also know and understand. But if you're talking to your grandma, it would be more a description of it happening rather than stating it as a specific example and being vague about it. So how in depth you go into these questions too matters based on demographics. Also, the audience's ethnic and cultural composition. Sensitivity is required for a successful speech. Any speech you give is successful because remember, you want to pertain to 100% of your audience. And if you say something that's offensive or you are only pointing out one area or one group of people, then you're not pertaining to 100% of your audience. So you're not having a successful speech. Make sure that if you're speaking in a different language too, that you're translating and you are using the right colloquial terms for your speech as well. This co-culture thing, we use different words in different languages, and making sure that your speech makes sense if you are if you have a hard time with English, or if you are giving a speech in Spanish and you're not totally fluent, make sure you're using the right colloquial terms for that demographic. Socioeconomic status, income definitely influences many aspects of life. So if you're talking about, a purchasing option for the marketplace, the way that you approach the money is going to be a little bit different. The way you try to sell something may be a little bit different if you know that the socioeconomic status of a group is income is just not as high as others. But also occupation really does matter. If you're trying to sell someone to a clerk at a gas station versus the CEO of a company, you're going to reflect upon different interests for that person and speak to them a little bit differently in different interests. You might talk about in the cost of something or how it's more cost effective for someone that's a CEO, and if it's someone that's like someone that works at a gas station, you might look at them and talk about utility. So how it's presented definitely matters, even though both are this important things to talk about and never dissuade or manipulate, but always pivot yourself a little bit different for audience analysis. Education also matters. If you're a senior and you've been taking classes over a topic that you're going to give your speech over, it's going to be really, really, really hard to follow if nobody else has taken upper division classes on that one scientific method that you're choosing. Make sure you use a different choice of words if you know that the education of some people in your audience is just not at the same level as you are. That doesn't make or break intelligence, by the way. This is not indication of intelligence. This is education. Education is an indication of what have you taken, what have you not taken, what has your audience taken, and what has your audience not taken. So make sure that you do not assume to talk dumb to people, but do not assume that they know everything either. So there's a fair balance and a fine line that you fall in between. And the training and briefing speeches will definitely help you with that kind of balance over what needs to be explained and what doesn't need to be explained. So religion and politics, these are kind of your no-no zones. Think about Thanksgiving dinner. You don't necessarily want to talk about religion very much at Thanksgiving dinner with people that have different beliefs than you or political affiliation. Whoever gets into a political fight with their family right before the election knows that these are sensitive topics. So avoiding these types of topics is usually good unless you are literally giving a political speech at a political rally or, giving a sermon. You would want to talk about these. But again, it's audience. If you're giving a sermon, you know your audience. If you're at a political rally, you know your audience. But when you aren't aware of religious or political affiliations, then just avoid as much as you possibly can. Gender's big thing. Avoid making assumptions based on gender, but also use gender neutral language. Instead of saying he, she, say they, them. Instead of saying you guys, say you all or everyone. And don't use gendered language. Gendered language, don't say my dudes or different types of gendered language, because it might not bother you to use it, or if someone uses it around you, but you don't know who you are bothering. And like I said earlier, you want to give a successful speech to 100% of your audience, not just the 1% or the 10% or even 90%. Why would you give a speech at 90% if you could give it 100%? So think about that when you are making assumptions about your audience or using things for audience based analysis in your speech. And just remember too, your audience isn't just in your intro. It's not just in that attention getter where you ask a general question. Hey, how many of you have ever heard of turning on a TV? Well, let me tell you about this great thing called a remote. That's not just when you use audience analysis. Remember to use it through examples throughout your speeches. Use it also when talking to your audience. Don't use you guys, but everyone comes to know that, remotes are really great when you don't want to get out of bed and those types of things. So think about your audience before you give any speech.